I'm a member of the International Socialists in the Netherlands here, and the International Socialists are a revolutionary socialist organization that fights for building socialism from below. So I'm a Marxist, and I'm also an ADHDer. And I sort of use that word in a way that the Dutch call a geuzennaam. And I don't think there's like a proper English word for that. But it's like sort of as a way of like reappropriating the meaning of the word ADHD, or I guess just like the word queer, because I think this is really a term that was assigned to me by capitalism. So that's why I use it in that way. And I think also here we already stumble upon like an important part of my talk, because what do we mean when we talk about, these so-called neurological conditions? How did these conditions, how did they came about, and who is using these terms, and why are these terms used? So I think, it's important to state that, I'm not denying the existence of neurodivergence or whatsoever. But I think what I am saying is that it's necessary to critically reflect on how neurodivergence came about also as categories, and how it is treated in a capitalist world, and also how capitalism has created disordered subjects, so to say. So I think in doing so, we must also then ask ourselves, how can we get to a better world for them? But not only them, the entire working class, because in the end, everybody suffers from the mold that capitalism demands from us. So what is neurodiversity? Well, first off, it's an umbrella term. It was a term introduced by a sociologist named Judy Singer in the 90s, who said that she herself was somewhere on the spectrum. And she argued that neurological differences, for example, such as autism, are just, what they are, a neurological difference and nothing more. And it was also a term she introduced to get rid of like these old Freudian theories that stated that the mother caused autism due to her upbringing, and, that sort of bullshit. So neurodivergency is very broad in its spectrum, just like ethnicity and gender or sexual orientation. I mean, you have people with ADHD, with dyslexia, with autism, with Tourette's. So this list can go on for a very long time. And even within these groups that I just mentioned, there are also subtypes. So, for example, somebody with ADHD can be very dreamy in the head, but not hyperactive in behavior. But somebody can also be hyperactive in their mind and in their behavior. Either way, neurodivergent people are people who work and think differently than neurotypical people. But the question of who is a neurotypical person is actually quite a vague question if you think about it, because that's like asking, what's normal, like who has control over that, and like who gatekeeps normality. Well, in a capitalist world, you'll see that this is mostly psychiatry that gatekeeps normality, but I will talk more about that later. But either way, I think that describing neurodivergency just merely as like a neurological difference is not really good enough to come to like a good analysis of what it really is. And I think it becomes actually a lot more clear what neurodivergent people are when we consider the role of capitalism. So I think a comprehensive analysis of neurodivergency should recognize that it's about people that are navigating the world in a way that is seen as problematic within capitalism. And I think, let's take an example of ADHD, as it is specified in the DSM-5. So that's the Diagnostic Manual of Psychiatry. Anyone who's like officially diagnosed gets so according to this book, but it doesn't mean you cannot be like neurodivergent if you don't have like this official stamp or whatsoever. So in the DSM, you see that one of the main criteria for ADHD is inattention. And they describe it with things such as, often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or other activities, often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish homework, chores, or duties in the workplace. For example, loses focus or gets sidetracked. Well, I mean, imagine that this is somebody living under socialism or communism. We can ask to what extent do these described symptoms actually pose a problem? Because what if we live in a society that is guided by the Marxist principle, to each according to their abilities, to each according to their needs? What if we let this person choose their own test that they want to take on and give them shape in their own way? And also, in addition, it's also clear that many of these symptoms that I just say focus really on how well a person can pay attention in school or perform a job, which is also completely, of course, aimed at sustaining capitalism. So that brings me to the next point. What does neurodiversity look like under capitalism? And I think for that, we first need to do an historical materialist approach to psychiatry in order to see how this works through in our current and important to add Western society. So for those people who don't know the term historical materialism, that's a Marxist term. And in short, it means that I will look at the conditions that play a role in the emergence of psychiatry as a social phenomenon that is driven by capital. And I will also therefore show how psychiatric institutionalization works in the interest of the capitalist class. So, well, first off, neurodivergency, of course, has always been around the years. And, the ancient Greeks had a tradition of worshipping these so-called and studying these so-called mad people. So, some of these people were given the status of a wise guide or a messenger of the higher things, and their behavior was studied to see what that would say about the earthly world. Well, this of course changed. This was different in the Middle Ages, where these so-called mad people were often burned at the stake because people often thought that they were devils or witches. But the origin of modern psychiatry, the principle of what we know today, that started around the 18th century. So Philippe Pinel, that was a French doctor who played a very central role in this. So he's often described as the father of modern psychiatry by many people. And I want to add a little bit of nuance by saying that he did some good things. For example, he campaigned for the abolition of shackling these mad people, and saying that we need to listen more closely to their fears and the things that they are struggling with. But he also said that these people could be treated and could be cured. And this later notion is really what capitalism has very greedily seized upon, and has also completely exploited it. Because obviously this idea is not a threat to capitalism itself, but it's a way to make this system run more smoothly. So, Pinel was actually at the forefront of seeing neurodivergency as disorders or these diseases that need to be cured. And you can already see this at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, because here there comes an interest from the capitalist class in getting their workers to produce faster and more. So you see also that psychiatry here is simultaneously developing as a place where these individual cases get sent to in order to be cured, so they can participate again and function in a capitalist society. So around the 1950s, it became really clear to capitalists that an industry could also be created around psychiatry, and people began to see mental health here really as like a business model, where like pharmaceutical companies and like technical companies can sell their products to in like very large numbers in order to make profit. So the pharmaceutical lobby has become even so strong that, in many cases, it even determines what disorders are in order to create a market. So if you take, for example, the panels of the DSM-4, like more than half of all members have financial ties to companies in the pharmaceutical industry. And with regard to the board of like mood disorders or schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, it was called, that was even 100% of the board that had ties with the pharmaceutical industry. Oh, I guess it stopped there. So that was my talk. All right, then I guess I'll give the floor to Sam.
So I'm Sam. I'm with Left Voice, which is a Trotskyist publication group fighting for socialist revolution. I'm really grateful for the comrades, especially Denver communists, who set this this event to discuss neurodivergent oppression from a Marxist framework. As I think Hilda explained really well, capitalism necessitates and profits from neurodivergent oppression and really all forms of oppression. And so I'm really glad to be thinking with comrades about the ways that neurodivergent oppression functions and how it relates to a socialist strategy that can overthrow capitalism. I myself am autistic, and a few years ago, I wrote for Left Voice about coming to terms with my disability and how it will never be meaningfully accepted by capitalism. And I appreciate that. I think that article was included in like recommended reading for this. And I've really appreciated hearing from autistic and otherwise neurodivergent comrades that my experiences are, there we go. Let me pull up my notes again. Yeah, no, I really appreciate hearing from autistic and otherwise neurodivergent comrades that my experiences resonated with them. One of the main things I wrote about was how my disability actually raises the question of work and its purpose under capitalism. Because the point of work under capitalism is to be as efficient as possible to create products which can generate profit for bosses and capitalists who don't work. And autistic and neurodivergent people are likely to be less efficient, or at least perceived that way. This has been my experience, and it makes keeping up in this system really hard. My ability to process visual input is delayed, which means I can't drive, and that limits how many jobs I can work if they're not remote or accessible by public transportation. And I'm sure many people know that we in the US do not have great public transportation. Also my fingers move clunkily, so jobs that require fast-paced hand work are out. And even when I've found jobs that I can do, there's no guarantee that my natural way of communication will be accepted. So I often have to put extra labor into masking my disability so that I can pass as neurotypical. And these are just my experiences, but they touch on a larger challenge that disability and neurodivergence presents to the logic of capitalism. A 2013 study by the University of Massachusetts found that adults with intellectual disabilities are more than twice as likely to be unemployed as adults without these disabilities. And this isn't because we can't work or we don't want to work. Of course, we don't want to do the grueling or arbitrary labor that makes up most work under capitalism. Not even neurotypicals want that, nor should they. But we do want to be able to provide for our needs. We want to be able to take care of ourselves instead of potentially being dependent on families or on underfunded and often exploitative nonprofits and programs. And we want to be part of the larger human experience where people produce things together and learn from one another. But capitalism doesn't value work for the larger human experience. Capitalism uses work for profit, for private interests, and the real or perceived added cost of accommodations for disabled and neurodivergent workers means less profit. So we're less likely to be employed and more likely to be left on the margins of society. I also think it's really important to highlight how, for many people, the oppression of being neurodivergent is also connected to other forms of oppression, such as racial oppression. There's a systemic lack of mental health resources provided to impoverished and disproportionately Black and Brown communities. And oftentimes when people from these communities do receive diagnoses, they're still more likely to be deprived of accommodations and support, and are more likely to be criminalized by the state and ostracized by ableist stereotypes for their different ways of interacting with the world. We recently saw how much more intense neurodivergent oppression is for Black autistic people in the murder of Jordan Neely in New York City. Jordan's life and his murder show the very worst ways the state treats disabled people who suffer other forms of oppression. He was an autistic person who was hungry, a Black autistic person who was hungry and having a mental health crisis, yelling about his hunger on the subway, which is disruptive in the eyes of capitalism, but not harmful to anyone. And much of why Jordan was hungry and yelling ties into the ways that his disabilities were exacerbated by the violence and trauma capitalism imposed on him. He was someone whose mother was killed in a femicide during his childhood and who grew up in foster care. Jordan Neely was an autistic person who needed help, but ableism put forward by capitalism teaches people to see those experiencing mental health crises in public as a problem or a threat. And racism makes Black disabled people out to be even more dangerous. In this context, Daniel Penny, an ex-Marine, saw Neely as a threat because he wasn't acting normal and choked him to death. And for days, the city, led by Democrats, but also in particular Democrat mayor and former cop Eric Adams, allowed Penny, Neely's murderer, to walk around, essentially deputizing his actions. And as an autistic person, I'm terrified around police, members of the military, and people who have received training by institutions of state repression because of cases like Jordan Neely's murder. And Black and Brown members of the autistic community have all the more reason to be afraid because they are all the more likely to be targeted and harassed and murdered by the state. As revolutionary socialists, it's important that we're fighting all forms of oppression from autistic people like me who are fairly safe and supported, but are devalued and disadvantaged at work and subjected still to stereotypes, to autistic people like Jordan Neely, who were left especially destitute under capitalism and punished by racist state violence for it. And we should include this to be internationally supportive of the neurodivergent community, which includes all those who have become disabled through imperialism and war. My article that I wrote about my experiences makes the point that the fight for autism acceptance is the fight for socialism. And I hope I've made clear that capitalism is not a system that allows for equality for neurodivergence. And again, Hilda really laid this out really well with a historical materialist perspective. The disability rights movement has made important advances and won reforms which make living with disabilities easier than it was decades ago. But still, these reforms have not and cannot change the logic fundamental to capitalism, which values people based on how easy it is to exploit our labor, how much profit we can produce quickly. This logic will never be compatible with disability and neurodivergence, and in fact creates and expands disability through the systemic breaking of bodies and minds. When capitalism cannot easily exploit the labor of disabled and neurodivergent people, many of us are treated as a problem for the state to deal with. So neurodivergent and disability liberation will have to come from the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and the building of a socialist system which values different forms of human behavior and directs resources to meeting human needs. As Marx put it, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And I think it is really important for us to be aware that in fighting for a socialist system, we're going to face powerful forces. We're going to have to fight the state, which will seek to co-opt our anger, and we're going to see the state crack down on us brutally. So I think we need to be prepared to seriously fight back against co-optation and repression if we start forming a powerful disability rights movement. And I believe that to wage that fight, we need a party that represents neurodivergence and disability. And I think this needs to be a party that understands the power that the working class has to shut down capitalism and grind production to a halt, because only the working class can do that. But in order to defeat a capitalist system that weakens class struggle by fostering racist, sexist, queerphobic, xenophobic, and ableist ideology, we need to fight against all forms of oppression, including neurodivergent oppression, no matter who is being subjected to it. To me, this makes it important that there's a party of, by, and for the working class that fights for socialism. And it needs to be one that organizes neurodivergent people with jobs to fight oppression by organizing and shutting down our workplaces. It should be a party that fights in solidarity for neurodivergent and disabled folks who want work but are denied it because of our disabilities. It needs to be a party that wages political struggle against stereotypes which hurt neurodivergent people, and which fights for secure, universal, inclusive healthcare and housing for disabled and neurodivergent people, and public education that accounts for different styles of learning so neurodivergent students don't struggle. And it should be a party that can lead powerful fights against the state, that organizes workers and movements to strike for justice when people like Jordan Neely are murdered, and which organizes the working class and the oppressed to fight against anti-worker institutions like the police and the military, which will always act as enemies of disability liberation and equality. I'm a member of Left Voice because at Left Voice, we want to open a conversation with disabled folks, with workers, with folks on this call, as well as everyone around the country interested in breaking with the capitalist parties, Republicans and Democrats, and building an independent working class party that fights for socialism. This is something that I and other autistic comrades at Left Voice have been able to work to build, and it's a project I'd love to build with comrades on this call today and any neurodivergent comrades we're meeting, because I'm really, really sick of living in a capitalist world that devalues me, treats me as lesser, and does this with the rest of the neurodivergent community. And I believe that with a strategy and a working class party fighting for socialism, we really can fight neurodivergent oppression and all oppression and move towards building a socialist world where autistic people and neurodivergent people really are meaningfully valued, safe, and accepted.
I'm Grant. I use he, him pronouns. I am a member of the Denver Communists, and I live about 40 minutes north of Denver, and I'm based on unceded Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho land. I'm actually a relatively new Marxist. I wasn't until George Floyd that planted the seeds in my head that helped me become class conscious. And then over the next 2 to 3 years, that I gradually became more and more open to leftist ideas. And eventually I found myself organizing with the Denver Communists almost exactly a year ago. So I'm relatively new on this journey of being an organizer and a revolutionary socialist. And I'm involved in this because when I learned about the horrors of capitalism, it really resonated with me, because every growing up, I always felt something was off about society, but I never understood it. And I was always told, this is the real world. You've got to just deal with it in a nutshell. And then after learning about why that's wrong, it felt very traumatic for me. And it felt very hard for me just to exist, knowing all this. And I can't really feel okay without not doing my part. So there's my monologue origin story. Today I'm going to present a case for abolitionism from an anti-ableist perspective. And then after that, I'm going to go on to explain why socialist revolution from below is the path to abolition and the liberation of neurodivergent and disabled people. Before we start, I just want to let you all know in advance that I will be reading my talk from a script, and that's because I struggle with translating my thoughts into words as part of my autistic experience. And without further ado, let us begin. In the eyes of the capitalist ruling class, workers are deprived of their humanity and are reduced to profit-producing machines. Our basic human needs are locked behind a paywall, leaving us the choices of starving to death or purchasing our right to survive another day. Due to lacking any property or other capital, we're left only with our bodies and minds to sell as labor to the bourgeoisie in exchange for a higher chance of survival. Should our ability to work not meet their demands, without hesitation, they'll throw us onto the streets, behind bars, or even into our graves. For those of us who are neurodivergent, selling our labor is a disproportionately difficult task for many reasons. Our brains are wired differently, leading us to behave, communicate, and process information differently to those who are neurotypical and can conform to the social expectations of bourgeois society. Because of our differences, we face a higher rate of unemployment, encounters with law enforcement, incarceration, and murder. In order to build a world where neurodivergent folks are included, nourished, and completely liberated, the abolishment of police, prisons, and all oppressive tools that the capitalists have at their disposal is required. The existence of police and other special bodies of armed men are necessary to enforce the will of the ruling class. Under capitalism, they exist to protect private property and instill fear into the working class and the press, should they act or exist in defiance of the ideals of the bourgeoisie. So how does law enforcement disproportionately target neurodivergent lives? According to a 2007 study, 20% of autistic and other neurodivergent folks in the US are stopped by police before age 21. 5% of them are arrested during these encounters. Because our brains function differently and we process and react to information in ways outside the norm, we're more likely to be seen as a threat and face brutalization and arrest. Half of the victims of the US police murders are neurodivergent or disabled. Law enforcement is also more likely to give a free pass to citizens who brutalize neurodivergent folks on their own accord. Earlier this month in New York, Jordan Neely was murdered on a subway by ex-Marine Daniel Penny and assisted by 2 other people. None of them faced charges until after more than a week of protests. Neely was Black, autistic, and schizophrenic. He was homeless and malnourished, and was yelling that he was hungry before his killers deemed him a public disturbance and murdered him by placing him in a chokehold in response. Penny eventually faced charges, but he was released on bail soon after and only lost his passport and the ability to leave New York State. He's still free to roam the state otherwise and can set his sights on another innocent person there anytime he wants. Now is a good time to acknowledge that the oppression of neurodivergent folks disproportionately affects those who are also Black and brown. In the fight for abolition, it's essential that we show solidarity and intersection between the anti-ableist and anti-racist struggles, as well as the struggles against all forms of bigoted oppression. The use of prisons also disproportionately harms neurodivergent folks. According to a study in 2016, approximately 66% of inmates imprisoned in the US are disabled. A majority of their disabilities are cognitive, with inmates being 4 times likely to report having one than not. Those who are in prison face hostile living conditions, which includes depriving them access to essential medical care and mental health services. As a result, their health often worsens than before they're incarcerated. Another horrifying byproduct of depriving healthcare to incarcerated neurodivergent folks is the use of solitary confinement. They are more likely to be subject to it, often being justified for their own protection. Even short stays can have long, intense consequences for those with cognitive disabilities, and it doesn't improve their well-being in any meaningful way. Alongside the use of police and prisons, I want to discuss another instrument of oppression that is used primarily on those who are neurodivergent, and that is the use of applied behavioral analysis therapy and all related treatments that seek to condition autistic and other neurodivergent folks into behaving acceptably to the bourgeois status quo. Many autistic self-advocates support renaming ABA and related therapies as autistic conversion therapy. And moving forward, I'll refer to it as such. Autistic conversion therapy is used for primarily young autistic neurodivergent people to teach them new skills and complete them in a way that is deemed socially acceptable. However, the methods of instruction are harmful and often traumatic for recipients. They have no control over their environment. Often, it's solely decided by their therapist and parents what should be achieved in the treatment. When being taught the desired behaviors, it's assumed that the recipient can't learn these unless they're incentivized through rewarding them for proper demonstration and negative reinforcement if they don't. The idea that these behaviors might hurt them isn't considered, and they're denied support for their sensory needs in the process. If such supports are allowed at all, they're often given as a reward for performing these acceptable behaviors and only used with a time limit. The sensory needs of neurodivergent folks are real and valid, and being denied these supports causes them real pain, which in turn activates their stress response, which can lead to trauma. Although punishments in autistic conversion therapy are no longer used, or at least not supposed to be used unless after using other methods still deemed appropriate, the treatment is still abusive and traumatic due to depriving its victims of any autonomy and their sensory needs, alongside the overall goal of trying to shape them into behaving in ways acceptable to capitalist society, rather than accommodating their diverging behaviors as they navigate society. So what is required for the liberation of neurodivergent folks? A society where neurodivergent folks have total liberation is first and foremost one where all forms of their oppression have been completely dismantled, not reformed, dismantled. Alongside this is one where all of their basic needs are met unconditionally, including but not limited to food, housing, transportation, education, healthcare, and social interaction. Additionally, such a society also grants neurodivergent people the right to pursue their passions and desires with equitable access to their neurotypical counterparts. Alongside ensuring that their basic needs are met, this can be done through unconditionally accommodating their other needs, whether sensory, communication, mobility, etc., regardless of what they choose to do in life. Capitalist mouthpieces will tell us that such a society is an impossible utopian fantasy, but a society where the liberation of neurodivergent folks and all oppressed peoples is in fact possible. Modern capitalist society produces more food, housing, and other essential needs to nourish the world multiple times over. Yet it refuses to do this in favor of manufacturing scarcity because it wouldn't be profitable and would render the system obsolete. For problems that we don't know how to fully solve yet, we have the means and technology to research, develop, and implement solutions at an increasingly quicker pace. But under capitalism, such efforts are devoted to tools of oppression and any means to delay its inevitable collapse. So since this society is possible, how do we go upon building it? Before a fully liberated communist society can be achieved, the current order of global capitalism must be dismantled. Our liberation must come from a socialist revolution from below to overthrow and destroy the capitalist state, and one that is international and transcends all national and state borders. It must be led by the working class, because it is the class whose labor keeps the capitalists afloat and can sink them by withholding their labor. Once the working class seizes power, it must abolish the capitalist state and establish a democratically controlled worker state in its place, also known as a dictatorship of the proletariat. Even after the working class takes power, capitalist oppression won't immediately vanish overnight. Only through a proletarian worker state can we successfully combat and put an end to the violent resistance of capitalists and make the revolutionary transition to a truly democratic society focused on human and environmental need. Building such a society will bring about neurodivergent liberation and of all peoples from the shackles of capitalist oppression. It will give neurodivergent folks and all of us a voice and a vote to advocate for ourselves in the workplace and every institution we choose to participate in. Neurodivergent liberation is the liberation of all peoples because all of our oppression is rooted in the upholding of global capitalism, and only through its destruction can we build the truly democratic, beautiful world we all yearn for.